Old Guy Talks to Me is a podcast dedicated to helping older guys create kick-ass lives for themselves and those that they love. Join me regularly as I share with you the things that I've learned about how to create that life that you wish for, that you imagined. Just because you're getting older doesn't mean you have to be old. And be sure to rate, review, and share this. And now, for our podcast. So you're sitting there wishing, I had a question I wanted to ask, or I had a comment I wanted to make. Well, now you can. Go to oldguytalks.com and become a member. Once you become a member, you're going to get advance notice of when I will be recording these podcasts and access so you can ask questions or make comments. Also, there'll be other benefits to being a member. What are you waiting for? Don't wait, don't hesitate, don't procrastinate. Do it now. Become a member at oldguytalks.com. You'll be glad you did. This is information only. Consult with an appropriate professional before starting any program. Do not be stupid. You are responsible for your own shit. The old guy is a capitalist and not a socialist weasel. He will be promoting stuff here and may be compensated. You can rest assured the old guy only promotes stuff he uses. You may have different results. This is Ors, the old guy from www.oldguytalks.com, here today with Dr. Scott Howell. He's with Tier 1 Health and Wellness in Tennessee. And we're going to be having a discussion about, well, your doctor says the labs are normal, but you feel like shit. I mean, you shit. I'm going to relay a few stories here about that. But before we get into this, we got to do our little legal ease. First of all, I need to let you know that while Scott has a MD degree, he chose not to go through the licensing process, and he does not see patients. Even though he works, helps in a medical clinic, he's actually a researcher in that clinical clinic and goes through clinical studies. And I need to tell you that he is one of the world experts on androgens. He sent me this bio and CV. And if I was to read the whole thing, we'd be here for an hour just going through it. The guy is a smart dude. So I'm just going to go through some of the highlights, and the highlights are several pages here. Scott Howell, PhD, Research Director and Primary Investigator of Tier 1 Health and Wellness Center for Clinical Research. He's a professor, epidemiologist, and exercise physiologist with research interest in the long-term safety of therapeutic androgen use, endocrine disrupting chemical exposure, and preventative medicine. His primary expertise includes androgen metabolism, interpretation of clinical research, statistical analysis, and research tools. He's the author of many articles spanning many fields. He's also served as a subject matter expert, co-authoring the Encyclopedia of Sports Speed for the National Association of Speed and Explosion. Frequently published in notable peer-reviewed journals, including the American Journal of Physiology, Endocrinology, Metabolism, Cardiology, Journal of Ethnopharmacology, Pharmacological Research, and the Yale Journal of Biology and Medicine. He has a PhD degree in epidemiology from Trident University in Sport and Health Science, from the American Military Institute, a Bachelor of Science in Sports and Health Science, and he is also a mechanical engineer. He currently is a faculty member at Trident University, as well as working at the Tier 1 Health and Wellness Center. He has received the American Military University Academic Scholar Award in 2016 and has taken part in 2 major National Institute of Health Department of Defense funded studies. He's also published. He's also on the now this is a big deal because they only take smart people to do this. You got to be really smart to be a peer review editorial board member. None of these journals will be found in the publisher's clearinghouse section when the guy comes and knocks on your door to tell you you're winning $5,000 a week for the rest of your life. There's the Journal of Preventative Medicine, Cardiovascular Disorders and Medicine, Blood, Heart, and Circulation, Journal of Diabetes and Obesity, Journal of Obesity Diagnosis, Journal of Insights in Clinical Pharmacology, Journal of Toxicology, Journal of microbiology. So Scott, you've been in school a long time.
Yeah, practically all my life.
How many years post out of high school, roughly?
I've been in school about the past 22 years of my life.
Oh wow, okay, that's a long time. That's a lot. That's a lot of learning.
I'm trying to put it to use now, right?
Well, at least you got it in something that's actually useful. Because you hear so many people spending this hundreds of thousands of dollars, up to the million range, and basically are unemployable. You definitely are employable. There's no doubt about it. So I'm going to relate this story here, Scott. And I've heard this more than once. This is kind of a fairly generic story. So I talked to a man about testosterone, because I personally, as I mentioned before we got on camera here, I've been on testosterone myself for over 22 years. And I hear this thing, and I talk to men about it, and they go like, well, I had my lab work done, and my doctor says it's normal. And then right after they say that, they say, but I feel like shit. And I say, well, what was your number? And one guy said 365.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And I'm just like, I'm not going to say what my number is, but I'll guarantee you
It's not 365.
It's not 365, and it's actually it's multiples of that. But see, so let's talk about this stuff. These normal ranges, how they're figured out, what has happened to them over time, and let's talk also most about the difference between normal, healthy, and optimal. So I'm going to let you go run with this.
Okay. Well, when I was preparing some stuff for this podcast, one of the things I looked for, I wanted to see how normal was defined in the literature. And I wanted to see if optimal had ever been defined. And what I found was there was this epidemiologist and scholar named Murphy in 1973. And he provided this clear explanation in 1973 about how defining normal must also give something to optimal. It should define normal. So if we ask ourselves what is the concern of the physician right now, if you go to a general practitioner, what is their concern? Is it normal? Is it abnormal? Is it optimal? Is it suboptimal? So we really can't have a meaningful discussion about what normal is unless there's an agreed upon definition. And what you will see is that a normal is anything but that. So this guy Murphy, he argued that if the physician identifies the normal within the scope of the optimal, then that maxim would force them to pursue the optimal instead of the normal. And that really made sense. And he said that in 1973, and he said it wouldn't be questioned by anyone at that time. So now optimal is not even on any physician's radar. And the fact remains that the normal a physician pursues in practice is not a unique state. It's a range of states, and it's predicated on three things. And he mentioned this too, and I think they're important. So I want to talk about them for a second. That first, the optimal or normal state is unique to each individual. And if you think about it, if you consider a laborer compared to a web page builder or something like that, what is normal to each of them, what is optimal to each of them is different. One has a different physical activity, different nutrition intake, etc. So this is different from individual just by philosophical discussion, and it's based on qualities. And the second point that he brought up was that it's often uncertain what these qualities are from people to people, from man to man. So if you think about it, polymorphisms of the androgen receptor gene, they're called CAG repeats, and it is an aberration of that gene. Well, that gene can cause desensitivity in one man, and lower symptoms resolution at a standard dose. But then another man could have higher sensitivity because of that polymorphism.
Okay.
and respond good to testosterone.
Okay.
So
So you use the term, and you mentioned a particular type of gene. What was? Can you kind of explain that a little bit more?
well, the androgen receptor gene is the gene I'm referring to, and the polymorphism is called the CAG repeat. It is the repeat of the CAG. And if that length is short, if it's less than 15, then that means that the individual will respond very favorably to any androgen therapy.
Okay.
They're a hyper responder. They're sensitive. A lower dose will resolve their symptoms. Now, someone that has a longer length of that, say up above 25 or even above 15, as you move on that continuum towards a longer length, then the person becomes more desensitized to any circulating androgen. So
Does even though it's a gene thing, I just want to ask that. Even though it's a product gene, is there age dependency on that in terms of how that gene is expressed?
I'm really not sure about age-related expression. I do know that under certain endocrine disruptors, that they have caused transgenerational effects. So the progeny of parents can be, the children can be affected. They can have longer CAG repeats. But as far as age, I would have to look at that.
Okay.
So the second, the point that this guy made was the first is the optimal state is unique to the individual. And we just saw that just lifestyle characteristics could be, but then the qualities are hard to identify. They're different. And that could be a genetic issue. It could be anything that would cause it. And what we'll see is that there are at least two mechanisms that are definite qualities that affect what the response is to testosterone. But Murphy also responded a third, and it was a pragmatic reason. It related to physicians. There's only a limited number of physicians and a limited amount of work in a day. So their work in the ideal situation should be extreme deviations from what is optimal. But now it's a deviation from a general notion of what is normal that's given the most attention. So if you think about that, what it forces is a more conservative and strict definition of disease. Mm-hmm. So not only is normal in a philosophical sense, like we just discussed, is it ambiguous? We'll see why here in upcoming mentions about why it just doesn't make good sense. So
normal actually includes more unhealthy people in that sample. Would that be a fair statement to say?
Definitely. Well, if you think about how these reference ranges are done, I think the recent harmonized reference ranges took 4 different cohort studies, 4 different populations in different regions. And I think some of these were overseas. But basically what they did was they took the average of all those populations and then took an average of that. And that was a harmonized range. But the point is about a healthy population is, where are you going to find a healthy population at this day and age? You would be hard pressed to find a healthy population unless you went to somewhere where everyone was completely isolated. You think about the underlying rates of cardiovascular disease, all the lifestyle factors influencing this. And in the guidelines that are published, they basically go to links to say that these are healthy populations, but all they're really doing is adjusting for BMI or some lifestyle factors in an analysis, but it's not comprehensive. I mean, we could arguably state just for that reason that it's not consistent across the board.
Yeah. So this is a problem in that what we're looking at in terms of these laboratory studies is that we're mixing in unhealthy people with healthy people, and so we're really affecting what the ranges of what's being perceived as healthy with just a huge sample of people in there that are not healthy. And as that sample of people that are not healthy continues to grow, which it seems to be in a lot of different areas, it really skews the reference ranges.
Well, it does, and you don't know unless you test if those, with the AR gene CAG repeat polymorphism.
Sure.
How many people in that sample had long repeats? I mean, is that a predisposing factor that should be considered? Well, there's really a lot that's left to the imagination with these intervals. But as far as testosterone deficiency, the diagnosis and management of testosterone deficiency, it remains controversial because of these deep-seated myths about development of prostate cancer and cardiovascular effects. And Dr. Nichols and I were just today sitting in my office talking about a book chapter that was just published yesterday in Springer in the Handbook of Experimental Pharmacology. And in their introduction, they come right out and say that therapeutic testosterone, or androgen rather, increases the risk of prostate cancer. And we have to think, where in hell have these people been living? Because the last 10 years of research that's been conducted on that is substantive. It's solid. Morgenthaler worked on a saturation model, and you never hear people talking about that.
So what's a saturation model?
Well, the saturation model is a threshold. And I didn't actually pull the actual numbers on it, but there's a threshold where testosterone will increase up to a certain point. But beyond that threshold, it's largely just, and it's a low threshold. I mean, we're talking about in the real low numbers. It's a small threshold. So it's almost negligible what was talked about. But I didn't pull that, so I really don't know the data. I really don't want to say for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So there's what a lot of people don't know is actually that over time, generational levels of testosterone have been going down in men. And you want to talk a little bit about what's going on there?
Well, there was 2 landmark studies that was published in 2007. The first was with Travison, and this is a guy that publishes a lot in the Endocrine Society journal. And the other was a study by Anderson, and both of them were 2007. One was in response to Travison, but in that Travison study, it was of around 1,500 some men, and these were randomly selected from the Boston location. And there was 3 different waves that were looked at. And the first wave was in the 80s, the second was in the mid 90s, and the other pushed forward into the 2000s. And what that study found was a 16.1% increase, or decrease rather, in testosterone levels over that period. And that equates to a 1.6% decrease per year. So if you think about that, I mean, that's substantial, because if you look at any of Travison's work, he is really thorough. That whole group is really thorough in their statistical analysis, their methods, and they did an outstanding job on that study. And if you think about 1.6% per year, I mean, that's a substantial amount. And then in response to that study, Anderson looked at a European, or it was Dutch, I think a Dutch population, where they had these samples that had been stored, and they had these birth cohorts that were set up. And the first birth cohort started, I think, in 1921. So that meant that the person was born in 1921. Now, when they were tested, they were older, but that was their birth cohort. So they established it based on that. And the second cohort was started at 1931 if the person was born then, and then up to 1940, and then to 1969. So in that first cohort of older individuals, there was only an 8% decline in testosterone levels. But each decade, like the next decade up from 1931 to 1939 in the birth cohort, it was 11% decline. Moving on up to a 20-year increment, it was a 12% decline. And then from those born in 1969 to 1970, it was a 16% decline. So that 16% decline is almost exactly what Travison found. And this was in a Dutch population.
Right. So this decline in testosterone has been going on for quite a while.
It is. It has. It really has. And it was interesting because when I pulled that data, we all know Basine. He's with the Endocrine Society, and he wrote an op-ed in response to these reports. And it was interesting, and I'll state this verbatim because it's really important. He said basically it was premature to raise alarm, but it would be unwise to dismiss the reports as mere statistical aberrations because of the potential threat of these trends that, if confirmed, pose to the survival of the human race and other living residents of the planet. That is Basine that sets on the Endocrine Society.
Okay, so he's an endocrinologist. That is a pretty that's an incredibly alarming statement.
Well, I saw it and I was like, whoa, this is really, I mean, I'm a critic of Basine's work, but when he had written that, it really resounded with me because, I mean, it is a big issue. It's something that Dr. Nichols has mentioned all the time with endocrine disruptors. And from our point of view, from the data that we've seen and what we see and practice every day, we believe it is a massive public health problem. And until we can redefine what normal is and address the elephant in the room, then these issues are going to keep changing. And it's odd because every day that I pull studies, I pull at least 20 studies a day because I get notifications from PubMed that they're published. So I'll pull these studies every day. There's 3 to 4 endocrine disruptor studies where they're coming in from all over the world, and they're showing substantial effects in a lot of different animal species. So we're sort of naive if we think that we're escaping that exposure when we're exposed to it every second of the day, basically every time that we drink out of a plastic bottle or, but it's alarming.
GMO foods, all sorts of stuff. Yeah, that was an alarming statement just when we were just talking about testosterone. And then, we have the Hebrew University study that talks about fertility rates in men dropping significantly.
Wow.
Yeah, mm-hmm. I'm sure you're you're familiar. You want to talk a little bit about how that seems like it almost parallels the drop in testosterone.
Well, it does, and there's some interesting parallels out. When Basine was writing his op-ed, he mentioned the fertility rate drops, but he also mentioned, I believe, congenital malformations, birth defects. And if you really think about it from a big perspective, there's 2 problems. One, actually 3. The men's testosterone levels are decreasing. Men with normal testosterone can still remain symptomatic. And then now fertility rates are dropping. And they're dropping at similar rates. And they're mimicking this drop in testosterone. So what that sort of speaks is that it is directly influencing the HPG axis, and maybe there's Sertoli cells of the and Leydig cells of the gonads. But I mean, we're remiss if we think that that's going to go away, because it's not.
I want to back up to something you just said, because I think I'd like to focus a little bit, that men with normal values can still be symptomatic. What is that? What is that about?
Well, there was, and I'll find this. I have.
And is that what they call testosterone resistance?
Well, no, I don't. Okay, here's the problem with that. When people say testosterone resistance, they always imply that the androgen receptors become downregulated and they don't respond to the androgen.
Okay.
In fact, any physiologic exposure to androgen in any target tissue will upregulate the androgen receptors, and it doesn't work. I mean, it only works in upregulation or downregulation, and it's dose dependent, meaning as levels decrease, the androgen receptor expression decreases. As levels increase, it increases. So the androgen receptor autoregulates. Now, With sensitivity, I'm talking about sensitivity based on the CAG repeats of the androgen receptor gene.
Okay.
Now, if it is shorter, then the person will respond better and faster at a lower dose with higher symptoms resolution. But if it is a longer repeat, they'll be more, they'll experience more adverse effects, and a higher dose is needed to achieve symptoms resolution. And so it's just it's one of the only mechanisms that will influence sensitivity to androgen therapy. And we know all men will respond. They will respond to testosterone, but it varies on what dose the individual will respond to.
And that gets to the point of now with all the pressure, there's a lot of pressure to quote unquote stay within the ranges, and a lot of times people are treated to a certain range without their symptoms being resolved.
Well, basically, what I see this is that there's restrictions that are when we start talking about defining normal. There's these restrictions that are placed on physicians. You can call them training wheels, you can call it a box of limits, whatever. And anytime that box of limits is placed on, and it's in medicine, that's how it is. If it fits into that box, it's normal. If it doesn't fit in the box, it's not. And until we get out of that box mentality, it's hard to look at signs and symptoms. But the interesting part that's consistent with all the guidelines is they're consistent in that there are three conditions to diagnose testosterone deficiency. That's signs, symptoms, and biochemical measures. Now, the interesting part is the signs and symptoms, sexual, physical function, sleep, all that. But the biochemical measure, as stated in the actual guidelines, says that it's to support a diagnosis of testosterone deficiency, not make the diagnosis. So what is written in text is not what happens in practice. Everyone goes into the box. If you go to a general practitioner, it's going to be a lab that you're going to have a lab draw, this or that. It's going to come back. If you are in the normal range based on whatever lab they use,
sure,
you're healthy. But we know that that is the furthest thing from the truth. If you are, just because you fall in that normal range doesn't mean that you don't have some type of polymorphism or anything that can affect that. So you might be unhealthy, or it's not an equivalence of health, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting that the guy Zitzman that did the androgen receptor polymorphism study, this is what he wrote, and he concluded this trial. He said a general threshold for testosterone levels in the diagnosis of hypogonadism do not exist. Instead, there might be individual thresholds of testosterone levels according to the length of the AR-CAG repeat polymorphism. And I'll go a little bit further and say there might be different levels based on the individual's exposure to EDCs.
Sure, that's a factor. Well, these laboratory values, my understanding is that recently they've been actually, the high and the low have been repositioned to lower ranges now. And what might have been considered low in the past is now falls into the normal category.
Well, it's from what I gather, and I'm not aware of what the some of the guidelines were 20 years ago. I'm not aware of that, but I do know that, for example, the two of the organizations that put out the guidelines for the values only give a range. Or let's see, hold on one second. Let me make sure. Well, okay, the AUA recommends two separate morning measures with a threshold of less than 3 nanograms per deciliter. The EAU recommends two measures between 7 to 11 a.m. in the fasting state with that cutoff. But all of these are similar, but they had a couple of them have fasting state measures, which is ridiculous because there's really no reason that's warranted. So if you look at the actual therapeutic ranges, though, what they recommend, and this will blow your mind, it really will. The Canadian Medical Association recommends to keep a person with a total testosterone between 404 to 505 nanograms per deciliter, total testosterone. None of the guidelines say anything about free testosterone, nor give guidelines for it. Now, the Endocrine Society jumps this from 350 to 600. And so we're left to think, well, what is that person's free T? Now, the largest one of all the 6 is the BSSM, and it's a range of 433 to 865. Right. So that is the most liberal range that we have. And every one of these are different. And 2 of them don't even give therapeutic range. They just state to do, or to keep the patient in the mid-normal range, whatever arbitrary value.
Whatever their symptoms are, no matter how they feel.
Yep. But it's not a shared decision process. And I think that's sort of it's misleading of the guidelines when they actually say it in writing, but they don't emphasize it. They say it as like a lesser component of the guidelines.
Yeah, I'll just anecdotally, I'll tell you a story of that. Last winter, I went with my youngest daughter to New Zealand, and just so that I did not want to, we were there for about 3 weeks, and I did not want to, one bad incident with the border agent can complicate your vacation dramatically. So I did not take my testosterone with me, and about 7 days into this trip, my wife goes like, "What's wrong with you?" I mean, she says that a lot, but it was more. It was the fact that it was something different now. And then about 2 days later, I was on the phone with her, and she goes like, "Are you taking your testosterone?" And I go, "No." She goes, "Wow, you've become really negative."
It happens, right?
It happens, and it's with the cyprinate, the half-life 8 to 10 days. According to some, and so that was just about the right time for it to start showing up, and it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. Just another story. I have a friend he was getting his shot every 2 weeks. I said,
100 milligrams or 200 milligrams?
It was both, I've heard, but I was just like, "Oh, you are on a hormonal roller coaster. You are just going up and down." And the best thing that happened to him was his doctor decided he didn't want to give him testosterone anymore. And I said, "That's great. That's good news for you, because now you can find someone that actually knows what the hell they're doing."
Oh, yeah.
That's pretty amazing. So we don't, this is just a battle that people are fighting, and it's a challenge for people in this space to find doctors that actually know what they're talking about and what they're doing in this space.
Well, I don't really know if I've really got a good background with a lot of physicians in the field, because I'm highly critical, and it was one of the characteristics of how I actually met Dr. Nichols. I mean, it wasn't bad what we had. I contacted him about working with the literature, and we saw eye to eye directly on that. But it's hard to find someone that will view your health like you want someone to view your health. And the thing about it is, it's sad, because with how insurance is set up now, you have to pack patients in like cattle, get them in and out according to an algorithm, according to that box. You listen to what they say, prescribe them medication, get them out of your site, and then on to the next time. But that's really not health. That's just Band-Aids.
Well, a lot of people don't realize is that the private equity group has bought that medical group, and now they have billable hours that they have to do and hit certain financial thresholds per patient, or else they get a reprimanding letter in their file from their employer, and possibly risk losing their livelihood. But that's these groups are buying these practices in wholesale, and they're really turning them into more medical mills rather than truly medical practices. And that's unfortunate. It's happening because a lot of times they'll have like 10 or 15 minutes to see a patient, and that's generally not enough. That's there's not enough time to really even understand what the hell's going on with that person.
Well, I was sort of surprised because Dr. Nichols would spend an hour. I mean, he spends an hour with each patient here,
Mm-hmm.
and that is truly unheard of.
Right.
At this time, I don't know of any other office I've ever been in where I spent an hour's time with the doctor.
Yeah, I've done that but it's always quote unquote a anti-aging doctor. So but then again, their whole model is different because first of all, they don't take insurance, and you pay and to a certain extent you get what you pay for. But I got to tell you, I do tease the hell out of my I call I have two types of doctors. I have my anti-aging wellness doctors, and I have my disease doctors, and I tease the shit out of my disease doctors, especially as I'm watching them age. And I've turned one. Now I got one more I need to turn before I'll feel pretty good about it. So let's just a little testosterone thing. What I'm hearing, maybe because we're going a little bit off of what we had originally talked about. What I'm hearing is that there are men younger and younger showing up with low testosterone, and that's a fact. And you see that kind of anecdotally reported in articles about millennials and youngers having less sex.
Mm-hmm.
All of those things. Can you talk a little bit about? And I think a lot of that has to do with endocrine disrupting compounds. So,
well,
address it.
Yeah. Well, the prevalence of testosterone deficiency in the overall population is around 2.1%. Is what's estimated at, but it increases to about 5.1% age around 70, 79. Past that. I really don't agree with those numbers because I think they're misrepresentative. But I mean, it's common. I mean, we have many individuals that are younger than what I would think contact us for help. And we have an age limit that we have here. So some of these individuals we just cannot help, but it's a growing issue where younger and younger men their testosterone levels are low, and it's a two-part problem. Again, younger men having low testosterone levels, and that being the primary issue with their symptoms, and then those that have normal testosterone levels but still are symptomatic, have all the signs and symptoms of testosterone deficiency, but they're in a normal range, so they never ever get a proper treatment. So now the mechanisms behind that, Dr. Nichols and I believe that endocrine disrupting chemicals are the main reason for a lot of the major health issues that we see today. And if you think about it, there was a report it was a congressional report in 2010. And a lot of people never ever heard of this report, but there was a lot of prominent scientists in that congressional report that testified in front of Congress, raising their hands saying, we have a big issue at hand. We have mapped all these disease increases to the production of EDCs and plastics processing, this, and that. There was even a mention of increases in autism rates, and that they were concerned that this exposure, which no one can escape from, and it doesn't follow a normal dose response. It's not monotonic, as Dr. Nichols states. It accumulates. The exposure can accumulate in individuals. So if it's detected, you probably have a problem. But they sounded the alarm, and nothing was shown in the media about it. Yeah. We had nothing that was covered on the TV about those scientists going in front of Congress or going in front of that hearing. And so I think it's bizarre that the Endocrine Society on their main website, they have a whole page dedicated to endocrine disrupting chemicals and their adverse effects. And they say, oh, there are these effects. But when we get a guideline, it's not factored into the guideline. Why? We know it's happening. The Tox 21 program from the National Institutes of Health. The Tox 21 program is based on identifying endocrine disrupting chemicals. They've identified over 10,000 chemicals that interfere with the androgen receptor. So how can we ignore a finding that big?
Yeah.
That there's that many chemicals around us and what's produced.
Yeah. I had a few days ago, I was at a function and I was talking to this young man, and most people are young to me at age 67. He was in his mid 30s, and he was built. He was a fireman. And he started asking me, what I do and this and that. And I said, I'm a blogger, podcaster, I spend a lot of time in the men's health space and vices too. I'm not all good. Scott, out of respect for you, I did not smoke my cigar out here today. So we got to talking about testosterone, and I was stunned. He said, "Oh yeah, I've been on testosterone for a year." And he's in his 30s. He's a fireman, and he said I was feeling miserable. He said all of these things, and he said I've been on it, and he takes about 1 ml a week. Does it 2 times a week. And he says he feels better. He feels like he's got energy. His focus is better. And he says what really was the important thing was that his wife told him that his asshole quotient went down significantly.
The AQ.
Yeah. So he said she really appreciated that. So it was, like I said, it was just, I just keep on hearing all this stuff about these younger people, and actually some of the urologists I talk to talk about younger and younger men showing up in their clinics with erectile dysfunction that they're dealing with. And so this is a bigger problem than most people are willing to admit and talk to. It's unfortunate, and a lot of misconceptions. You had mentioned about in another interview, you talked about a few studies out of the Mayo Clinic by a gentleman of, I want to say, Blairjean.
Blairjean.
And could you just kind of briefly touch and kind of give us an overview about that?
Now, was that in regard to VTE risk?
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Well, interestingly, I've been writing a critical review of the Walker study that was just published in JAMA, and it was a case crossover. And we'll get back to that in a second. But with Blairjean, his studies have been probably the best secondary data analysis studies that I've seen, because he's methodical and he interprets the results in the scope of the data. He doesn't try to draw inference outside of what's in the actual data, and that's a big thing for me. So you try to draw conclusions just based on the data. And so a lot of these are, like Blairjean's work is based on insurance claims, whether these have been billed. And he's done so many studies. He's did some on prostate cancer, he's did some on VTE. But what Blairjean had found in his was that there wasn't an increased risk of VTE on receipt of a testosterone prescription. But Martinez, a researcher from Europe, did this case control, and he actually used the wrong study design. It should have been a retrospective cohort, but his comparator group was way too small. But he tried to establish a risk of VTE. And if you actually look at what they're doing, when they're using secondary data like this, you can't quantify the exposure period. Okay. So how do you quantify the receipt of a prescription? That doesn't guarantee that the person takes it based on their treatment plan. So it's just a record that's in a data set. And that's how a lot of these studies are generated. And that's why I like to critique them.
So let's talk. I'm going to kind of switch gears here a little bit. And actually, I want to talk a little bit about. Let's talk about the FDA black box warning. and the whole cardiovascular risk factor, and what went into that, and the two, as I refer to them as the dead men walking studies. And I had not realized that some of them actually included women.
Yeah. Well, the study by Vegan, there was two studies to get everyone on the same page. There was two studies that came out. I think they were in 2013 because the FDA issued black box warning was in 2014. That one study by Vegan and one study by Finkel. So both of these reported adverse cardiovascular effects, but when there was critique that was leveled towards Vegan's study, and it was, I believe it was based on veterans claims data. And when they actually went in and looked at the methodology and looked at what was actually compared in the data, they actually had women that were in there. And that's a big no-no. It's a study of men and you have women that have been sampled, then you just pretty much screwed all credibility that you have. And even though they went lengths to say it should be retracted, Morgentaler's group issued letters to the editor, they still keep the study and it has not been retracted. So you have to ask yourself, what's the current state of publishing right now? And the Finkel study was really no better. I mean, we can't make a black box warning based on these type of secondary data analysis that have so many confounding factors in them. I mean, there's so much going on. Receipt of a prescription and then linking an outcome that's in a data set is not the same as running a perspective forward and seeing what actually occurs. It's just not accurate. It's misleading. It's highly misleading.
Yeah, no, that is unfortunate because those are often repeated, and it's the basis for a lot of the scare tactics that are out there that are used to keep people away. I know I have a friend of mine who's he's constant battle with one of his doctors about this, and so it's always an issue. Let's talk about a little bit about the switch gears, and I maybe just for a few minutes here. Let's talk a little bit about aromatase inhibitors. And so, first of all, what is an aromatase inhibitor, and why people use it in testosterone, sometimes in testosterone therapy? So, what does the aromatase inhibitor does?
So, aromatase inhibitor aromatase inhibitors were developed for treating breast cancer in women. And they effectively drop, they can competitively inhibit. There's different types of, but anyway, they knock estrogen down. They won't allow estrogen to bind. Some of them are suicidal inhibitors, but that's what they're used for. So in men come to TRT or any type of hormone replacement therapy, and they automatically have these preconceived notions about what they've learned in other areas. And that's why AI use is so bizarre in a way. And I say that because the symptoms that they have attributed to estrogen are not really real. They're predicated on other mechanisms, but largely ignored. And I'll tell you a story. I met Dr. Nichols because I'd been looking at ARCO and ERCO studies, and I'd been also looking at illicit androgen abuse.
So, you use some abbreviations there. What were those? This
ARCO are the androgen receptor knockout studies.
Okay.
Are the estrogen receptor knockout studies. And these were animal models on different species. And I'd been studying illicit androgen abuse for about 15 years. And I just went through all this literature and all these echocardiography studies of these guys that have abused androgens. And I started noticing something. And when I looked at the pathology in the animal studies, the estrogen receptor knockout studies and the androgen receptor knockout studies, I found there was a similar pathology on both ends of the continuum. If you knock out the estrogen receptor, you get collagen infiltration in the heart muscle. And you also get a loss of conduction velocity from the apex of the heart, Purkinje fibers, all the way up. And it's on both sides of the spectrum. I saw that, it really started to click. And then I was reviewing forensic reports of these bodybuilders that had been taking massive quantities of different things. And I was looking at the histology slides, and they have almost the identical pathology: collagen infiltration, cardiomegaly, and loss of conduction velocity. And so it occurred to me that the missing component in all the case reports, the 1,000 that I'd compiled, there was no mention of aromatase inhibitor use. And so at that point, my beliefs started to shift that aromatase inhibitor use was causing harm. And it might be one of the underlying reasons why a lot of these guys are falling over dead now, because they take a massive amount of aromatase inhibitors to effectively zero it out. So I'd sent some emails to prominent physicians that I believed were using prescribing aromatase inhibitors. And I asked them to work with me in the literature to resolve our beliefs and write a paper. And Dr. Nichols was the only physician that responded to me, but he did not prescribe aromatase inhibitors. So we were on the same page. He was in the clinical side, I was looking at illicit abuse, and we saw the harm in both areas. So there is no real merit to blocking estrogen in men. And if you think about it, in all the clinical trials that have been conducted since way back with the earliest trials that have examined testosterone's effects, none of them have blocked aromatase.
Right. So would it be safe, would it be accurate to say that actually estrogen is actually very, a level of estrogen is actually very important for men to have in them, in their system, for a number of reasons?
Well, it's definitely important. You have every, what I came to believe after looking at all the literature is anytime that you influence aromatase and don't let it do its job in men, and you don't allow aromatase to internally match in proportion to the testosterone, it aromatized into estrogen for binding, then you have pathology, and it's on a continuum. The more that you regulate that, and it's insidious, it doesn't happen overnight. What it does is it happens over 5-10 years until you're already screwed. You already have this pathology. And the thing about it is bone tissue, heart tissue, any target tissue, basically any target tissue for androgens is also a target tissue for estradiol as well. So it was interesting. I pulled this case report of a guy that he had presented to practice. He was infertile and he had this bone pain, and he was 31 years old and he had been seen regularly over the years and everything. Well, the doctor tested him and everything, and he ended up being put on 250 milligrams of testosterone and nanthate. And that brought his total testosterone levels up, but his bone pain persisted and his bone mineral density didn't change at all. So they tested his DNA, and it came back that he had a deficiency with the P450 aromatase enzyme. Okay. And that's the aromatase enzyme to convert estrogen. So they took him off of testosterone. They put him on 50 micrograms of estradiol twice weekly. All his symptoms resolved within 4 months. This guy had bone mineral density increases in his bones at 4, 7, and 9 months, and he didn't have full plate closure. This guy had never had full epiphyseal plate closure. Mm-hmm. He had full plate closure at 9 months.
Basically, by plate closure, what you mean is that's what happens when you're fully developed in terms of growing.
In your bones, in the bone.
And typically in a man, that usually happens in their late teens, early 20s. Would that be correct?
Yeah, that would be about right. But this guy was 31, and it was interesting when he was treated with estradiol. All his symptoms resolved. He had a more favorable lipid profile. I mean, all these benefits, and he never developed gynecomastia. He didn't. There was one other. There was one other issue he didn't, but he didn't develop the symptoms that are normally attributed. These guys attribute to estrogen symptoms with TRT.
Right.
And the thing about it is that symptoms like water weight and stuff like that, they usually subside within about 3 to 4 weeks if the individual is on a therapeutic dose.
Sure. And the gyno, that's actually a genetic situation. Is that correct?
It is largely. If you have sensitive tissue, the only way that you're really going to get rid of that tissue, that mammary tissue that's in there, a hormone sensitive tissue, is to have it removed. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that aromatase inhibitors can be used short term for that, but they don't treat the underlying problem. And there's a lot. It's just useless to use a medication that's not addressing the actual problem. And it will come back. It's not going away.
Yeah. Well, Scott, I want to thank you for being on the program here with me. We've covered a lot.
We have.
And some of it was at a pretty high level. So I think that we got really into the weeds here, which is really good, because a lot of times, especially if you have to go into a physician's office and to discuss this, you really need the facts and not just kind of the stuff that you get out of People Magazine or Men's Health or something like that, someplace like that. To really drill down into those things. I think that's an important thing. I want to thank you, and I look forward actually to maybe having you back and really get into this whole endocrine disrupting compounds. You mentioned you got some. You have a paper that you're putting out on that, and
I'm working on one, and I have a presentation I'm working on for this upcoming year. So I'll be compiling the information. Glad to come back on.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that, because I think that has also huge ramifications for everyone, for young and old. So I'm, my life is pretty well set in terms of, what I'm doing, but I certainly also concerned about my kids' life. So I think that has ramifications for old guys and as I say, and those they love. Mm-hmm. So, this is Oris, the old guy from www.oldguytalk.com here, signing off his interview with Dr. Scott Howell, PhD, a really smart dude, where we really get into the weeds about, what those lab results actually mean when you get them from your doctor. Remember, it's all about creating a kick-ass life for yourself and those that you love.
Are you a man suffering with erectile dysfunction? Or know of a man suffering with erectile dysfunction? Well, the answer that you are looking for is at myjunkdoesnotwork.com. You heard that right, myjunkdoesnotwork.com. What you'll find there are interviews on cutting-edge medical therapies to treat erectile dysfunction with experts in the field. That's right, experts. One of them is actually even a therapy that you can do in the privacy and comfort of your own home at a fraction of the cost of what it costs in a medical office. So what are you waiting for? You want to regain your confidence as a man? You want to regain your ability to pleasure your partner and yourself, both physically and emotionally. Don't wait, don't hesitate, don't procrastinate. Do it now. Go to myjunkdoesnotwork.com. You'll be glad you did. Old Guy Talks is all about creating a kick-ass life for yourself and those that you love. Don't wait, don't hesitate, don't procrastinate. Opt in now.